So I'm here today to kind of just tell you all that I was wrong. I was potentially very, very wrong with an MO opinion that I had, but I couldn't be happier about it. I wanted to be wrong. So far, I am. When Bioware gave up on Star Wars: The Old Republic, a game that had reportedly made them over $1 billion during its lifetime and one of the biggest MMORPGs out there, despite some of the struggles over the years, especially with the scope of their expansions, recent expansions anyway, I really thought this game was done. It was over. It had kind of passed over from having some kind of consistency, some kind of updates to it was going straight into maintenance mode. But it isn't the case. I was wrong about what would happen to Star Wars: The Old Republic when it moved over from Bioware to Broadsword, a much smaller company. The game just continues to chug along, pushing out updates constantly. But there is one huge caveat, one giant thing that I really need to happen for me to finally put the nail in this coffin of me being just wrong about this. One thing that Star Wars: The Old Republic and Broadsword still have to do. Before we talk about what Broadsword still needs to do and what they have already done with the MMO, we have to talk about what was going on before the game actually even went to Broadsword. Potentially why, because that actually informs a lot of how and why it might still be successful even now. 12 years ago, Star Wars: The Old Republic launched to excitement and acclaim. It brought Bioware's storytelling, especially with companions, to a new audience through an MMORPG that leaned heavily into an era of Star Wars that had been underserved, the Old Republic. Bioware had made 2 single-player RPGs, Knights of the Old Republic, but this was their first MMO, and it was an MMO that was coming on the heels of Star Wars Galaxies finally being shut down. Probably, potentially because Star Wars: The Old Republic was being made, and well, licensing is really expensive, and at the time, Sony Online Entertainment was not doing so hot, and continued to not do so hot afterwards. For some, Star Wars: The Old Republic became their favorite MMO ever. It leaned very heavily into being, in many ways, a World of Warcraft clone, from combat to dungeons to PvP. If it was in World of Warcraft, it was essentially in Star Wars: The Old Republic, but it innovated in one huge way. Companions for your character and personal class stories that delivered in different emotional directions.
Companion characters are some of the most powerful storytelling tools that a storyteller at Bioware can use, and that's mainly because they can evoke emotion in a player like no other character in the game. They're helping you in your adventures, they're helping you in combat, they have opinions on story. You really build a rapport with them, and because you build that up, when they get hurt or something happens to them, you really care.
Now, before we go too far in this was never the kind of thing for me when it comes to an MMO. The whole idea of taking an RPG and putting it in the MMO, that's less of what I look for in these games, but that doesn't take away from the fact that a lot of people really loved this part of the game. A lot of people really loved the storytelling, and the storytelling, despite any other flaws in this game, was actually really good. The class stories of this MMORPG were very good, and they did it in a way that was kind of handled pretty well. For ages, Star Wars: The Old Republic challenged Final Fantasy XIV as an MMO with some of the best and most impactful storytelling. But that wasn't really to last. Over time, the storytelling got less and less, and well, less. As happens with MMOs, as they age, a lot of the times the quality tended to fall, as the budget seemed to fall. There were missteps along the way, like when they went free to play shortly after launch, but did so with an incredibly aggressive payment model that restricted free to play players to what amounts to less than a trial in other games, charging microtransactions by limiting access to the very things that free to play was supposed to help with. Social activities like grouping and PvP, as well as limiting how many credits you could have. Since then, they have gotten rid of a lot of these restrictions or eased them up by a significant margin, making the model much more fair, or at the very least, playable. Though it's obviously still much better to pay a sub for the game to actually get to enjoy it all. but it was still becoming clear that this game was going downhill. Despite routinely being considered a top 10 or even top 5 MMO by many, including several major media gaming outlets, it was in bad shape. Its expansions were perhaps the biggest sign of this, as they just kept getting smaller. They abandoned the class-focused stories that were so good for something more manageable. Single narratives, but even then, the size of the expansions just kept shrinking from previous iterations. Something encompassed pretty well by this post last year on the Star Wars: The Old Republic forums titled, "Why are the new storylines so small?" To which LD Little Dragon responded, "Limited budget and resources. The original game was incredibly expensive and they had to scale back, even for the first expansion. The devs can only work with what they have. Plus, have you seen the vitriol when they release non-voiced content? The devs can't even scale back on voice acting to try and get more story content without being lambasted for it." This is part of why I talk about this idea of putting in an RPG into an MMORPG. This idea that you have to have all these cinematic things and all these storytelling parts of it. The same kind of things where you would expect in an RPG. It kind of sets up a game potentially for failure, because if you cannot maintain that quality that is not just limited to just having a functional MMORPG that people enjoy, but also the same kind of quality you might expect from an RPG, well, then you've really let down your audience, because that's what you promised them. Some other MMORPGs that have tried to do this and actually are succeeding are perhaps Elder Scrolls Online, Guild Wars 2, World of Warcraft, and of course, Final Fantasy XIV. But they also have really big budgets still. Okay, perhaps not some of those. I mean, Guild Wars 2, they do a lot with a little. But still, it's a lot. You're putting together two different types of requirements. People want both. And to say that this game was expensive is not hyperbole. You see, we actually have numbers for this. And in a bit of a dated, admittedly, list from GameRant, it came in as the second most expensive game. The budget of $200 million to make this MMO back when it first launched. That comes in just behind the ongoing bloated budget of Star Citizen, which has now exceeded $600 million. I don't believe this includes the marketing budgets for Star Wars: The Old Republic, which would have probably swelled it substantially. To add just a bit of perspective on that, it's believed that World of Warcraft, when it was made, its budget was $63 million back when it launched in 2004. But even back then, it potentially had up to a budget of $200 million when you include marketing. So just consider how big the Star Wars: The Old Republic budget might have been. Oh yeah, and the fact that it's licensed. This is even more stark than it seems though, because the other games on this list are all primarily big budget single player games, with most of them in recent years when the cost of games has really kind of skyrocketed, as we've seen from the FTC trial over Microsoft and Activision, which found that Last of Us Part 2 cost $220 million to make, and Horizon Forbidden West cost $212 million to make. Both higher costs than Star Wars: The Old Republic, but in an entirely different market, a much more expensive one, as game costs have grown substantially. Game costs that now Star Wars: The Old Republic has to pay to maintain the same kind of quality that they were making before. In short, this was an expensive as hell game to make, and it was also an expensive as hell game to keep up with, something that became especially difficult when your player base dwindles. And so, you get what you have. You got smaller and smaller expansions. Ones that try their best to maintain the standard set by the huge budget, with in-game cinematic animations, emotional storytelling, full voice acting, and more. So you basically had Bioware making a single-player RPG within an MMORPG with a shrinking player base to play said MMORPG, trying to maintain the same kind of quality that they started out with a budget that is shrinking. So you could say that perhaps the writing was on the wall when Bioware decided, instead of throwing more money at an aging MMORPG, they could take those similar budgets and instead just throw them at a single-player RPG. In fact, that's exactly what they said they were doing, stating this in the blog post when they sent Star Wars: The Old Republic over to Broadsword. As we look, quote, as we look toward the future, Bioware is focused on being a leader in developing immersive, emotionally charged single-player games, with teams primarily in Austin and Edmonton. Single-player games, moving out of the MMORPG market, and from what we've seen, moving away from live service games, at least so far. Perhaps they learned a little bit of something from Anthem, I guess. Bioware's support for Star Wars: The Old Republic ended with a final major update, 7.3, with a large portion of the game's staff moving over to Broadsword. Broadsword is actually also a company somewhat under EA, which is probably why this transition from Bioware to Broadsword was actually pretty damn seamless for players, with no change in account migration or anything like that, and no disruption of service. There have been other MMORPGs out there that have undergone similar changes in who was in charge of the game and had much more problems when they're trying to migrate over with lost accounts and having to sign up on new accounts, new systems. If you just asked a player that had no idea what was going on with Star Wars: The Republic, they probably wouldn't even know that Bioware wasn't the one developing it anymore. And perhaps one of the bigger ironies of all this is that when the MMO moved over to Broadsword, the developer was already the steward of two other older MMOs, Ultima Online and DAOC. It was a very small team known mostly for just kind of maintaining those MMO, treading water, keeping them up, not actually developing them. And when Star Wars: The Republic moved over, it wasn't just the MMO going to this small team. A lot of the team that worked on Star Wars: The Republic, the team that was more than double the size of Broadsword, moved over to, well, Broadsword, leading some to quip that it was more like a Star Wars: The Republic takeover of Broadsword than the reverse. Unfortunately, as happens with these things, there were layoffs. It's really just a shitty part of this, where they're unable to properly deal with the amount of staff that they have, and this kind of shift over there is like cost-saving bullshit. So it sucks. There was a lot of people that still worked on Star Wars: The Republic that no longer get to. But at least quite a few of them did get to move over to Broadsword. I believe it was something around like 30 or 40. I'll post down in the description down below how many it was exactly. But at that time, when all this was happening, it felt like the writing wasn't just on the wall. Star Wars: The Republic felt like it was already an MMORPG in decline, mostly because of the shrinking size of their expansions and the lack of content. And now with this shuttering of them, basically like moving away from the developer that actually made the game, Bioware, to some other company that was known not for developing games but maintaining games. Well, and now the writing on the wall was like bright glowing, and it was screaming, and it was saying your MMO is fucked. But that's not what happened. Though, to be clear, it still might happen. But at least for now, I'd say that Star Wars: The Republic at Broadsword has exceeded expectations. They've had several positively received updates since the move, including an expansion into more story-focused events, like the date night experience with companions, which is ironically a very Bioware-esque update, and more big story patches, 7.4 and 7.5. The 0.x numbered patches tend to include major story updates. And alongside these, there were several other smaller updates that brought in different features of the game and zone refreshes. In the community letter from Star Wars: The Republic's executive producer, they recount some of what happened between the move from Bioware to Broadsword from June 2023 to June 2024. 11 patches, a new APAC server, and collaborations with Lucasfilm. The game is continuing to add content almost every month under Broadsword, just as it did under Bioware, and in some cases expanding, with new small features like the date night or farming, new events, etc. One could say that the game continues to thrive at the same cadence it had under Bioware, but one major hurdle remains to really show that I was wrong about it moving to maintenance mode under Broadsword. One huge thing still needs to happen: an expansion.
Trusted to lead the Republic, but you were deceived. And as our powers of the dark side have blinded you.
The last expansion we got for Star Wars: The Republic was The Legacy of the Sith, which launched all the way back in February of 2022. And it was largely panned for being small and kind of forgettable in a lot of ways. If we're keeping track, that means the last expansion for this MMO was over a year before it left Bioware. And now over 2 years since it landed. And the thing is, we have no idea if this game will ever get another expansion. Broadsword has not made expansions before, so we'll have to see if this is if there's going to be any kind of announcement, because if the game is done expanding and the only thing they'll continue to do is these story updates, which are, you know, to their credit, free content, but small bite-sized bits of content, well, I think it might be fair to say that the best years of Star Wars Republic are not just well behind, but just a distant memory. Basically, you could say that they're from a long, long time ago. But if in the next couple months we get an announcement that some kind of work is going on for an expansion, even if it's maybe just like some little hint of it in some of the EA earnings calls saying, hey, there's work on this content for Star Wars: The Republic coming out in late 2024 or sometime in 2025, well, then I will full-throated say that I am so damn wrong, and this game is going to continue to thrive. But until we see an expansion, it does seem like there's that lingering possibility that any steam gain from them moving over to Broadsword, it's not enough, and this game will become like many others and just kind of wither. But for now, at least, I'm happy to say that I was mostly wrong. I'm very happy to say that what I thought was going to happen to Star Wars: The Republic has not happened yet. It's exceeded my expectations, and perhaps I was being a little too negative on Broadsword. I'm very happy to eat my words with a smaller company exceeding expectations and doing more than I thought they were. So, you know, honestly, congrats to Broadsword, and congrats to the team of Star Wars: The Republic for continuing their cadence after so much movement, so much change, because that's not easy. But you know, in the meantime, while we wait to see exactly how this all ends up with Star Wars: The Republic, another game, in a sense, perhaps a spiritual successor, without the IP and without some of the things that I think a lot of people liked about it, might actually be coming to you sometime, soonish, maybe, at least to test it, because Raph Koster, the creator of Star Wars Galaxies, actually gave us a lot of details about his new MMO that you'll be able to play soon-ish. Here, in this video right here. Go check it out. See if it's something that you're interested in. If you like SWG, there's going to be some things in there you enjoyed, and probably some things you'd miss.